it's a great honor and privilege to introduce to you the speaker, the plenary speaker of today, Jo-An Occhipinti. She's an epidemiologist and a system scientist. She's associate professor at the medical faculty and also health, I think is a health professions or health science faculty at the University of Sydney. And she also has important leading roles as co-director of the Mental Wealth Initiative Brain and Mind Center and managing director of the Computer Simulation and Advanced Research Technologies. I was very impressed by reading on her website a sentence which highlights also the broad scope of her perspective. Her research transcends traditional disciplinary boundaries by integrating mental health, economic and social frameworks and metrics to guide transition to well-being oriented economies and inclusive prosperity. So I was in particular, let's say, touched by the focus on prosperity. I don't know whether you are familiar with the history of economics, but the classical approach to prosperity dates back to this guy, Adam Smith, who wrote in 1776 a work called The Wealth of Nations. So in the perspective of Adam Smith, prosperity means the development of markets and the production of the highest possible level of goods and services. Thanks to the introduction of the national accounting in 1934, I think it was the first contribution of Kuznets, we have today a very strong and powerful metric, which is GDP. And GDP has become the most important target, and probably you have followed in the last couple of weeks the tariffs of Donald Trump, which are, of course, impacting the GDP of the different countries touched by this measure. Probably few people know that 30 years before Adam Smith, in Italy, there was an alternative approach to, let's say, classical economics called economia civile, civil economy. And one of the author of this tradition wrote a book titled About Public Happiness. So the focus, at least in Italy, was already 3 centuries ago on happiness, on well-being. And the target was the highest well-being, collective well-being of the population. And finally, we will have today insights into a third approach, which is probably, let's say, intermediate between GDP and happiness, which is mental health. So I found in the literature, Natural Mental Health, a paper by Jo-An where she explained how it is not about replacing GDP, but is taking GDP and going beyond to include other dimensions. Let me focus for a while on the World Happiness Report I call a touch of chauvinism. In the year 2015, the annual report on global happiness and countries' happiness presented a clear result. I read, let's say, the sentence. Maybe it's the chocolate, or its reputation for neutrality, or how much it's known for investing in the health, education, and employment of its people. Whatever the reason, Switzerland is the world's happiest place, according to an analysis of more than 150 countries. This is the story, but it was a short-term story, because since then, we observe a constant decline in the happiness of the Swiss. So probably the policies performed in Switzerland were still strongly oriented to GDP. They are not keeping, let's say, and if we look at the difference in absolute terms, the loss of happiness, of average happiness, it is a moving average over 3 years, so the changes are very slow because of the moving average, but in the World Happiness Report of this year, 2025, the decline in the happiness of the Swiss was comparable to the decline in the US and in Canada. So probably we have not to continue being addicted to growth, which is, let's say, still the orientation of many, many, many countries. But we need to look for different policies, and the title of today's plenary speech is Economic Policy Making Us Sick? A Path to Rebuilding the Mental Wealth of Nations. So Jo-An, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luca. And I think Adam Smith went wrong. It should have been the mental wealth of nations. It all started there. Okay. So thank you, and what an enormous honor it is to deliver this opening plenary of the 2025 Swiss School of Public Health Summer School and kick off another intellectually rich exchange. Let me start with a question that I'd like you all to think about. If a nation's economy continuously grows, but its people grow lonelier, sicker, more anxious, and less resilient, is that truly a wealthy nation? It's a question my journey as an epidemiologist and systems scientist has led me to, and one that is central to what I want to talk about today. Now, over my career, I've worked across a diverse set of health challenges, from malaria elimination in the Southwest Pacific to chronic disease prevention, alcohol policy, tobacco control, childhood overweight and obesity, child protection, homelessness, and most recently, in the last 5 years, mental health system strengthening and youth suicide prevention. All very different issues, but many of the same challenges of fragmented systems, siloed solutions, and the focus on symptoms rather than the root cause. So complexity has been another common feature. There's not a meeting I've been to, whether it be with academics or policymakers or other stakeholders, that hasn't concluded with an agreement that a particular population health challenge is complex. So naturally, about 14 years ago, I started to look for a science that had the tools to analyze that complexity. Tools that can account for interdependencies, feedback loops, and nonlinear dynamics. And so began my journey in systems science, and particularly systems modeling. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with systems modeling, it involves systematically bringing together best available evidence, data with expert and local knowledge in a way that really allows us to posit and test complex causal relationships, to project forward and understand the likely trajectory of a particular health or social problem. And as you can see from this example, it allows us to test alternative scenarios and understand what strategies are likely to deliver the greatest impacts. After more than a decade of leading systems modeling research, particularly in mental health, one very obvious common lesson really stands out. That while these tools often tell us really important things about where to invest limited resources and how best to strengthen health systems to improve system performance, they also commonly show us that the inflow of people becoming unwell consistently exceeds the outflow or recovery. So the prevalence stays high or continues to rise, and systems remain under pressure no matter how much money we invest in strengthening and expanding those systems. So healthcare systems have increasingly become sick care systems, forced to focus on acute and crisis management rather than prevention. Of course, none of this is new to those of us that are focused on prevention and particularly on studying the social determinants of health. But the problem with the social determinants of health agenda in the eyes of policymakers, from my experience, has been that it's simply overwhelming. For example, a recent systematic review found evidence of more than 20 distinct social determinants of mental health alone, from early life exposures to unemployment, social exclusion, climate change, social media, homelessness, and many, many more. So essentially what we're saying is that to make real progress on a particular public health problem, policymakers need to solve all of these other problems, a task that can feel impossible within political and budgetary cycles. So this prompted us at the Mental Wealth Initiative to bring together experts from psychology and population health, economics, business, computer science, policy and system science to take a more systemic perspective, to explore whether in fact many of these factors we call the social determinants of health are merely symptoms or manifestations of a key higher order cause. And that exploration took us back in time, not quite as far back as 1934 when GDP was founded, but to the founding meeting of the OECD in December 1960. And it was at this meeting that member nations signed a convention pledging to pursue the goal of highest sustainable economic growth driven by the post-World War II aspiration to enhance living standards and foster global economic development. So growth in GDP from this point was catapulted to the top line indicator of a nation's good management of their economies and welfare of their nations. Since then, economists and governments have devised policies and reforms to enhance economic efficiency and optimize macroeconomic arrangements to achieve that consistent growth in GDP. But as system scientists, we understand that an overemphasis on optimizing one system can destabilize other interconnected systems, giving rise to a broad range of symptoms we now recognize as the social determinants of health and mental health. We have been in such ruthless pursuit of greater and greater consumption, economic efficiency, and worker productivity to achieve that continuous growth in GDP that our health, social, political, and environmental systems are now showing significant signs of deterioration and fragility. So today we face polycrises that are having profound impacts on our way of life. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an example of what we're talking about, something kind of more specific. So in many advanced economies, industrial relations reforms implemented since the 1980s and 90s to boost business flexibility have also resulted in increased job insecurity, intensified work pressures, and reduced the financial security of households. Similarly, financial deregulation, along with other economic policies, has seen household debt soar in many advanced economies. So these have knock-on effects of increasing parental stress, family conflict, disengagement, and can increase the risk of drug and alcohol misuse and domestic violence, all of which can significantly influence, affect mental health and well-being. More broadly, economic policies putting profits before people are fueling wealth concentration, cost of living pain, and a growing sense that hard work no longer guarantees progress. The promotion of hyperconsumerism has made having status and stuff the measure of success, reshaping social values towards greater individualism. Collective goals are often eclipsed by personal ambition and self-interest, and a climate of high competition for scarce resources is resulting in a scarcity mindset taking hold, breeding distrust, fear, a hypervigilance to threats, and conflict. Is it any wonder then, during a critical developmental period when young people are building identity and purpose and connection, that these exposures are driving up rates of depression, anxiety, and casting doubt on the fulfillment of their ambitions? So the fallout of economic policy, particularly since the 1980s, is clear. A fractured sense of community, deepening polarization, growing isolation, and an erosion of our collective well-being. Loneliness has become a public health crisis, not only affecting mental health, but also increasing the risk of heart attack, stroke, and premature mortality. Recent evidence from the Framingham cohort study shows that loneliness led to a 3-fold greater increase in dementia, in subsequent dementia, even among those people with no genetic predisposition to dementia. But it's not just our social and psychological health that's been eroded by economic policies focused on growing GDP at all cost. Policies that subsidise the production of cheap, processed foods, a lack of stringent regulations on nutritional content and labelling, and poorly regulated fast food density have facilitated obesogenic environments, driving up rates of obesity and chronic disease risk, and especially affecting disadvantaged populations. So, to make broad, sustainable progress in turning down that tap, we need to recognise that there's no single instrument more powerful in changing the course of a nation's health and wellbeing trajectory than economic policy. And this thinking initiated more recently initiated the global wellbeing economy movement, which began in 2018 with the establishment of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. This partnership was initiated by Scotland, Iceland, and New Zealand, and later joined by countries including Wales, Finland, Canada, and Australia. And these nations are pioneering efforts to measure prosperity beyond GDP by incorporating a broad range of indicators, including life satisfaction, educational attainment, health, income inequality, and environmental sustainability into their national frameworks and budgets. And 2024 was a pivotal year. There was a special issue in the bulletin of the WHO, which we had the privilege of contributing to, which informed the drafting of a special resolution on economies for health for all. And at the 77th World Health Assembly, member states overwhelmingly endorsed this resolution, recognising the inextricable link between economic policies and health, including mental health, and committing to realign economic health with the well-being of ecosystems, communities, and individuals. Later in the year, the UN General Assembly adopted the Pact for the Future, which among its action items formally recognised the inadequacies of GDP and called for urgent development of measures of progress that better support sustainable development and well-being orientated economies. But despite decades of efforts to move beyond GDP, there are many reasons why it remains entrenched. One of which is that wellbeing indicator dashboards, while they do provide a very rich picture of various dimensions of population health and wellbeing, often have upwards of 50 different indicators. And so they fall short in providing like an overall picture of progress in the way that GDP does. So as a result, GDP remains the privileged indicator with its growth as the primary objective, and investments to foster social and population health are secondary if nations can afford it. And this is really a major barrier to achieving wellbeing economies. So that's why, rather than trying to replace GDP, the Mental Health Initiative and its partners are seeking to expand it to account for the value of social production. Now, it might seem counterintuitive to suggest expanding something that I've just described as a potentially corrosive force. But precisely because GDP is so globally entrenched in policy and politics, adapting it to include the value of social production could harness that influence to shape policies in ways that strengthen rather than erode the foundations of well-being. So let me explain. Social production is the glue that holds societies together. It includes unpaid activities such as volunteering, caregiving, ecological restoration, informal mentoring, and civic participation. Essentially, all those activities that contribute to strengthening the social fabric of communities. So why is social production so important? Well, from an economic perspective, we argue that social production supports our ability to be productive in the formal economy. For example, a grandmother caring for grandchildren enables parents to work. And neighbourhood volunteering builds trust and networks that help businesses thrive. It can also act as a stabilizer during disruptive events, redistributing resources and mobilizing workforces to support recovery. And we saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic, where neighbourhood initiatives and buy local campaigns supported small businesses, while volunteers mobilized to support contract tracing, phone hotlines, childcare for frontline workers, and awareness campaigns to control transmission and speed up business reopening. During the 2019-2020 bushfires in Australia, communities rallied to save local businesses and houses, and then established campaigns called the Empty Esky and Spend With Them. And this is where they encourage city folk to take a road trip to fill up their esky with goods from local suppliers to support regional business revival. And I'm sure you can think of similar examples like this of social networks mobilizing during crises from your own countries. But beyond crisis response, social production expands access to talent and skills and mentorship and the social development of intellectual property. This mutual dependence between civil society and business shows that economic and social production are two sides of the same coin. Both are essential for multi-sector resilience. Now, from a health and social perspective, social production gives people a sense of belonging and purpose and connectedness that fosters their mental well-being. For young people, supported engagement in socially productive activities can offer meaningful social roles and the opportunity to develop a positive self-concept, empathy, community connection, and an outward sense of purpose. Research has indicated that during the adolescent years, engaging in volunteering reduces the likelihood of poor mental health by 28%, although more robust research is needed in that space. For older adults, the evidence suggests that engagement in socially productive activities contributes to healthy aging through reductions in loneliness, improvements in quality of life and their mental health, and reductions in functional decline and risk of mortality. For example, an experimental study in Baltimore in the US highlighted the power of intergenerational interaction. Older adults volunteering in elementary schools as reading coaches, library aides, and classroom mentors showed increased or preserved brain volumes in memory-related regions, demonstrating the cognitive benefits of sustained, socially productive activity across generations. Also, as health and social systems become increasingly stretched, the social production of care will become an important pillar of system sustainability in the face of aging populations, rising chronic disease, and declining youth mental health, as well as the loneliness epidemic. So in essence, social production makes nations more prosperous, more cohesive, and more resilient. Now, I often talk about social production as the missing part of the production equation, the fruit of human productivity that we don't currently systematically measure, and we certainly don't sufficiently invest in. While economic production is an indicator of the health of an economy, social production is a macroeconomic indicator of the health of society. And together, they are the metric of the strength of a well-being economy. So the distortions have occurred because we've only systematically measured and valued one side of the equation. So in light of this, could it be that some countries considered rich in economic terms are actually poor in social production, while those labelled as poor nations may in fact be much richer? So just how substantial is this invisible economy? Now, we've only done the calculations for several countries so far due to lack of access to data. In Australia, though, social production is estimated to be about $287 billion annually, and that equates to about 14% of our GDP. To put this in perspective, that's larger than our mining sector, which contributes only about 12% of GDP. In the US, social production is valued at 2.3 trillion, representing 9.8% of their GDP. And in Norway, it's worth 284 billion Norwegian kroner, equating to about 5% of their GDP. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. The largest contributors to social production are those that are traditionally undervalued in the formal economy, namely those aged over 65, women, and the unemployed. Now, these values are most certainly an underestimate because available data usually only covers about 3 or 4 of the 8 categories recognised as social production. And we have little visibility on how social production has been changing over time. And this really needs to change. That's why the Mental Wealth Initiative has developed a digital measurement tool that enables nations to quantify and track their social production. And the app can be deployed at community or provincial levels or even national levels, and can even be used to measure corporate contributions to social production as part of their ESG reporting. But also, countries that have implemented time use surveys in the past could actually leverage that existing infrastructure and expand it to include all the categories of social production. So, valuing social production promotes a more inclusive narrative of what it really means to live a contributing life. One where our worth isn't solely defined by contributions to the formal economy. By recognising social production, we acknowledge the real and enduring contribution people make to our economy and to society across all stages of life, from young people to caregivers, to the unemployed, to people with disabilities and older adults. The formal and informal economies are not separate entities competing for resources. They are interdependent systems that are both vital to sustainable prosperity. But despite the enormous value social production is, despite its enormous value, social production is almost entirely absent from our formal economic measurement system called the System of National Accounts. And this invisibility is having profound consequences. When we fail to measure and value social production, we also fail to adequately support it. And as we have seen, we can actually implement policies that inadvertently erode it. So assigning a dollar value to each hour spent engaging in social production is not simply a technical exercise. It's an act of recognition. It's a statement of what we value as a society and what we're committed to preserving and strengthening. So by measuring, monitoring, and regularly reporting on the value of social production and integrating it into the national accounts, we can help nudge economic policy towards fostering social, environmental, and human health and well-being. And this narrative and approach can open the door to innovative solutions and new streams of research to inform policy that rebuilds the social fabric and the mental wealth of nations. Now, just in the minutes I have left, I'm just going to go on a small but really important and relevant tangent. But this tangent underscores why social production could matter now more than ever. I want to talk about the accelerating disruption of generative AI and how economic policy will determine whether that disruption will strengthen or further erode the conditions that underpin population health. Stable quality employment is the bedrock of societal strength, providing not just financial security, but it also fulfills important psychological needs. It's a source of shared identity, a source of social connection and integration, and it can provide a sense of productive purpose that makes our lives meaningful. But generative AI poses a threat to the future of work, and here's why. It's rapidly evolving and acquiring the capability for learning, creativity, adaptability, and strategic thinking. Capabilities once thought to be uniquely human. The pioneers of this technology and leading entrepreneurs are now openly acknowledging that generative AI is fundamentally a tool for replacing cognitive labor that will affect professions across virtually every knowledge-based field. Generative AI also enables an unprecedented convergence of all the state-of-the-art technologies, including advancements in computing power, cloud storage solutions and extensive databases, and advanced networking and APIs. And this convergence really allows for broad and rapid integration of generative AI across a range of systems. Now, estimates of job loss vary. A conservative estimate by OpenAI researchers, Goldman Sachs and others suggests that 25% of jobs may face displacement across the economy. Estimates by the Brookings Institution suggest that approximately 60% of work tasks in the US face medium to high exposure to displacement by AI in the coming decades. Now, we often hear three responses to this concern of job displacement. One, that those that are displaced can simply be upskilled, as this is what's happened in the past. Two, that new jobs will be created. And three, that generative AI will simply augment rather than replace human labor. So let's have a look at how likely each of these are. Firstly, let's look at the question of upskilling. So this graph shows the share of employment by type of occupation in Australia, just as an example. Past technological advancements have led to the automation of routine manual and routine cognitive tools. And as you can see with the declining green and yellow trends, demands for this type of work have decreased. So those areas previously exposed to automation have lost jobs, and these jobs have not come back. Concurrently, there's been upskilling and an expansion of opportunities in non-routine cognitive tasks, as you can see with the blue line, trending upwards. And these jobs are more specialised and typically associated with higher wages. So past technological advancements that have increased opportunities for non-routine cognitive work have contributed to the growth of the middle class and has helped sustain and grow economic demand, because the greater the middle class, the greater the capacity for consumption. But it's precisely this substantial segment of non-routine cognitive jobs that is now under threat. And generative AI can be upskilled far more efficiently than humans can. Routine cognitive and non-routine cognitive employment makes up more than 60% of total employment in Australia. So we, like many advanced economies, are highly exposed to this threat. Now, using systems modelling, we demonstrated that there is a threshold or tipping point beyond which AI-related job displacement creates a self-reinforcing cycle, where increases in unemployment and underemployment that happen too rapidly or too extensively reduces per capita disposable income, leading to reduced consumer spending and depressing even those sectors not directly affected by AI, causing further economic contraction and job losses. So we end up with this paradox of recessionary pressures, which are terrible for mental health and well-being, despite rising productivity. But won't new jobs be created? Well, most people agree the answer to this is yes, but will enough be created to offset the loss? In previous industrial revolutions, machines replaced muscle and routine, while humans retain the monopoly on cognition and creativity. We no longer have that monopoly. Today, generative AI targets those very domains, so even if new industries emerge, they may not require as much cognitive input at scale as has been needed in the past, or may prefer machine cognition altogether due to its speed, the cost, and scalability. This marks a fundamental break from past patterns of technological disruption and recovery. And our modelling for Australia suggests that if generative AI did result in a 25 percentage point increase in unemployment and underemployment, then a 10.8-fold increase in the current rate of new job creation would be needed to offset the loss in disposable income, a level that seems unlikely without extraordinary action. Finally, we commonly hear that generative AI will simply augment rather than replace labour. And at an individual level, that may be true. But in aggregate, what happens really depends on how organisations respond to those productivity gains. Will they adopt a strategy of retain and reinvest in workers, or will they downsize and extract value? And here's where I become a little bit pessimistic. Because this decision won't just be driven by the profit motive. It will be driven by competitive survival dynamics. So what do I mean by that? Well, a McKinsey analysis across 800 occupations estimated that almost half the activities people are paid $16 trillion in wages to do in the global economy have the potential to be displaced with generative AI, even with current technologies. So to remain nationally and globally competitive in an AI-driven economy, companies across industries will seek to increase productivity through adoption of this transformative technology and reduce costs by shedding excess labour. And we can already see this starting to happen. Oh, sorry, before I get there. So for low to middle income countries, the implications of generative AI are less well understood and may play out slightly differently. Falling costs and mobile-based access could open up opportunities in health and education and skills development, helping to bridge the gap in critical services. But a number of these economies, including India, the Philippines, and Bangladesh, rely heavily on offshored cognitive work in IT services, customer support, accounting, things like that. So these jobs are now at risk of being reshored to high-income nations. So this could mean reduced foreign investment and a widening of inequalities. So ultimately, the balance of risk and opportunities will be shaped by each country's economic structure, their access to AI capital and infrastructure, regulatory capacity, and the strength of their social protection systems. Without deliberate national and global policies, the transition could deepen vulnerabilities rather than reduce them. So this is not an issue that will be naturally sorted by market forces. Without a proactive response, the risk to social and economic stability will be profound. I'll just skip over that. So this destabilizing effect is really under a do-nothing scenario. So we're advocating for governments, business, and labour organisations to really come together to prevent the worst of these potential effects. And a range of strategies have been proposed, and I know we're running out of time, so I won't go through them all now. But really just to say that there is no easy answer. But the implications are too important to be left to government and economists to debate and decide alone. And so far, you know, they are a little bit stuck in the debate on whether this tsunami of job displacement is even coming. So amid the hype and counter-hype and with little in the way of preparedness planning, we are sleepwalking into one of the most profound economic transitions in our history. In the context of this transition to an AI economy, and I'll bring it back to social production becomes a strategic asset, not just in strengthening the social safety net that will be needed to look after the displaced, but also in providing alternative avenues for productive purpose and participation that are essential to our psychological well-being and social stability. So I'll finish by saying that we are at a pivotal moment in history that calls for a new approach. The thinking and tools that guided us through the 20th century are simply not suited to the challenges and threats of the 21st century. Wellbeing economies are crucial for achieving sustainable progress on the social determinants of health. To really turn down that tap and make nations more resilient to the potential destructive impacts of generative AI and climate change. However, shifting the entrenched economic narratives and frameworks will require more than the efforts of progressive economists alone. We all have a critical role to play, alongside economists, in contributing to the science and the debate on economic policy, in the implementation of new metrics that shed light on the systemic forces driving our health outcomes, and in advocating for systemic investing and mobilising communities for change. We must push ourselves beyond our disciplinary boundaries to reshape economies that will foster health and wellbeing for all. Thank you.